kick us off and to talk about the macroeconomic state, it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the stage Derek Neldner, who is the CEO and Group Head of RBC's Capital Markets and a member of their Group Executive. He has global oversight of the firm and helps set the growth strategy for RBC's corporate and investment banking teams. Can you join me in welcoming Derek to the Energy Disruptor stage? Welcome, welcome.
Morning,
Great to
Holly.
have you here.
Great to be here.
Don't know what we're sitting on, but I really like them. Derek, you have an extraordinary portfolio and role when you think about the scale of what you and the team at RBC do. And you just heard Peter there. I thought it was interesting. For me, his tone had a very optimistic tone at the end, but there was also that commentary through the presentation around, or the question, can we get there faster? Can we get there on the timeline we're talking about? So I thought I might just kick off with your observations. You have a lot of experience in the energy space. What's your take at this moment in time on the energy transition and the complexity that's involved with even that terminology, right? Or those two words.
Well, thanks, Holly. Great place to start. And before I jump into that, I would just say thank you and congratulations to you and all the organizers. It looks like a wonderful agenda, and I think it's going to spark a lot of great discussion and debate over the next 3 days. So thank you very much for convening all of this. You know, I think one thing everyone here will agree on is the threat of climate change and the challenge of climate change is very real.
Yeah.
And to address it, it is going to require nothing short of an enormous transition. And I think it's important to recognize that we talk a lot about energy transition, but it's actually an economic transition. This isn't just about energy and our supplies and sources of energy. It's fundamentally, how do we power factories? How do we power transportation? How do we grow our food? All of the choices that we as consumers make each and every day in terms of our lifestyles. And so it is very broad in scale relative to other transitions we've seen in the past, whether that be in energy, or Peter used some great examples around technology. And so I think it is very complex. It involves having to bring together a lot of different parties. So it's not just the private sector and businesses that are producing and supplying energy, but it's bringing together consumers and all of the end users. The other big complexity is somewhat stating the obvious. Emissions are global. They don't stop at borders. And so it does mean this is a global problem. And every country, every region is coming at it from a different position. They have different underlying economies, different political systems, different societal ways of living, and bringing all that together in a coordinated way is going to be very difficult. And then the other item that we're all seeing today is this balance of three somewhat competing priorities around energy, security, reliability, and affordability with sustainability. And all we have to do today is look at what's going on in Europe with the energy crisis, and it's really highlighting for all of us, that's a very complex balancing act to navigate through. So all that is to say, it is a big transition. I think it is a very complex transition. I'm personally optimistic, though.
I was going to ask you that, because you've been involved in this sector for a while. How has the conversation, the momentum, the economic reality changed in your time in the energy space?
I mean, it's changed dramatically. I mean, I've had the pleasure of working with different parties in the energy sector going back over 20 years. And the narrative today is very different. I think everybody understands the importance of net zero by 2050. Everybody understands the role that the energy sector has to play. At the end of the day, you know, what's important with the transition is we have to get to an end game in 2050, but along the way, we have to continue to meet all the demands for energy that we have in our lives today. And if you look at recent years, conventional hydrocarbons still represent over 80% of the energy supply. And so inherently, the energy sector is going to be playing a very critical role in helping with this transition. Decarbonizing their existing footprint, making investments in big projects, longer term technologies, whether that be CCUS or LNG or other forms of renewable power or nuclear, as well as some of the bolder, more innovative technologies, fusion, hydrogen, others that I'm sure will continue to evolve. But I'm optimistic that when I look at my experience working with the energy sector, it's very, very smart and capable people, great technical expertise, highly entrepreneurial. It's an industry that's used to living through cycles and having to adapt and pivot, and I would say people in the Canadian energy sector in particular have shown a remarkable resilience and ability to adapt. And there is a lot of capital. The fundamentals of the sector are quite strong right now, so I think it's positioned well to make some of the investments to drive the changes that will be needed. But, you know, it's a 30-year transition.
It's a great point, though, about some of the characteristics that are almost inherent in the industry itself that set it up to be able to navigate the transition effectively. I wanted to ask you, you touched on the complexity there and just the scale of the challenge too. It strikes me that it's, without question, the leadership challenge of a generation. What is it like for you personally as a leader facing into that, delving into, you know, how to lead your organisation, how to make the right decisions, set the strategy? What's that like for you as a leader personally?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think it's difficult for everybody, and you know, one thing I'm very lucky is I feel I've got a great team around me that help me with some of those leadership decisions. But I think for all leaders, it really comes down to setting the long-term goal. We know where we want to get to over the next 28 years, but importantly, realizing we have to have a very thoughtful path to get there. We can't just have objectives but no plan along the way, and we have to realize it's a multi-year journey. And as part of that, you have to set the long-term strategy, set the plan, and then determine what are some of the key principles that are going to guide you on that path. And so, for us, at least at RBC, we've talked a lot about the importance of an orderly transition. There's a lot of risk to the economy, to society, if it unfolds in a disorderly manner. And again, we're seeing that at different places around the world. Part of an orderly transition means we have to have all stakeholders at the table, and we have to have all perspectives and viewpoints at the table. And that means conventional sources of hydrocarbons, new innovative technologies and renewables, other industries, agriculture, manufacturing, real estate.
I feel like you're describing our audience.
We need everybody. Everybody has a role to play in it.
Yeah.
And so that starts to shape then as a leader, how do you go about it, right? How do you convene? How do you bring people together on a thoughtful path over what will be a multi-decade journey?
Absolutely. I want to touch on a couple aspects because I think your insights in the role that you play are really unique. One is just your span across geographies and the insight that gives you into how this conversation's playing out in different parts of the world. Can you speak a little bit to what your observations are around trends or just how this challenge is facing into different parts of the world differently?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's, you know, one thing I enjoy about my role is I get the chance to talk to a lot of leaders across sectors and across countries. And you do see it is not an even transition, and it is playing out in very different ways right across the world. Obviously, we saw in many ways Europe was leading on the transition, and they were ahead in terms of investments in renewables, ahead in many areas of energy efficiency. Consumer preferences were starting to evolve a little quicker than we were seeing in other parts of the world. That's obviously now changed dramatically with the unfortunate situation around Russia-Ukraine and the impact that's having on energy security, reliability, and affordability. And as Peter alluded to, that may in the short term cause some steps backwards, unfortunately. But I do think that in many ways, Europe will continue to play, you know, a leading role. North America has, you know, continued to evolve dramatically. I mean, I go back 15, 20 years ago, I remember when we were looking at building regasification facilities to import gas, and now we're, you know, North America's exporting gas. And so as a region in terms of North America, we've seen a significant evolution. I think one thing North America brings to the table is tremendous access to capital, a tremendous track record of innovation, very good policy and regulatory frameworks. We've even seen that with some of the recent announcements in the US around the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the incentives that are being driven to drive the innovation that's needed. So I think North America will play a very important role as well as we continue to move on this journey.
And the other thing is, from an industry standpoint, you made the point earlier that this is not confined to the energy sector itself. I mean, you have a portfolio of clients across almost every conceivable industry. How are you watching different sectors approach this challenge? And who, I guess, are the ones that we should turn to if we're looking for points of light? Who would you call out as sort of sectors that on the whole have got some really great examples of leadership going on?
Great question. I mean, I think it's difficult to single anyone out because there are pockets of innovation and advancement going on everywhere.
It's encouraging.
I would say energy transition, ESG, climate broadly is a top 3 agenda item with every management team, every board of directors we speak to, right across all industries. You've got higher emission industries like energy, power utilities obviously, but mining, industrials, real estate, agriculture, that are all very focused on driving new technologies to reduce the direct emissions of their operations. Increasingly, supply chains are becoming very relevant, and so for a lot of companies, food manufacturers, consumer products, retailers, where they may not have as much of a direct impact, but they're very focused on how they're sourcing products and the sustainability of their supply chains. We've got enablers of the transition. The tech sector is very focused on it, and again, you heard Peter talk about the role that technology, data, digital will play. It's creating tremendous opportunities. Infrastructure, whether that be energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, real estate, housing infrastructure, that's all going to support more efficient energy use. And then you obviously have the financial sector, where asset managers, pension funds, financial institutions are all very focused on what role do they play in this. And I think, I know a big focus of this conference is convening and bringing people together, and that would be one of my key messages, is how do we take great work that's going on across all these different sectors and increasingly bring sectors together to share best practices. And I would say, being in Calgary, a great example of the partnership approach that's needed, I think, is the Oil Sands Pathways Initiative, right? Where you've got some of the largest energy companies coming together to find solutions and share best practices. We need to continue to expand that kind of model across a full range of industries.
And we'll hear a little bit more about that from one of our speakers later today. I wanted to ask you as well, we've talked a lot about business, but we haven't mentioned government, we haven't talked about consumers yet. Let's maybe take them one at a time. What role does government have to play in this whole conversation? And particularly, I guess, given we're talking about macroeconomic situation, financial incentives, just the capital markets piece, what role have government got specifically in that?
Well, I think government has an absolutely critical role to play, because part of this is, again, how do you bring together various stakeholders around what are some competing objectives? So if you think about the energy transition, we need to very carefully balance climate and sustainability with the economic impact and with the social impact. Government has to play a key role in balancing off those objectives through a long-term strategy. And ultimately, that has to be brought to life through a very good and clear policy framework that's going to guide what does industry need to do along this journey? What do financial institutions and capital providers need to do? And what do consumers need to do? And I think that will involve both some restrictions or slowing down in certain areas, but then how do you provide the right incentive mechanisms, to your point, to drive the investment, drive the behavior that's going to be needed ultimately to reach net zero?
Particularly with the increased capital that we need, it seems we're going to need to convene every tool at our disposal to make that possible.
Exactly. And I do think as we go through this transition, there are going to be a lot of risks to balance, and some of those are going to be difficult for the private sector to address or individuals to address. And I think there will be some areas, early stage commercialization, for example, of
can you say more about that? Yeah.
Where I think government support, government incentives to help de-risk some of the early stage innovation will be very valuable.
Absolutely, completely agree. Now, on the consumer side, I love one of the comments Peter made. He mentioned, I think his phrase was, the multi-dollar decisions at the kitchen table as much as the multi-billion-dollar decisions at the boardroom table, which I thought was such a great way of framing that all of us are in this in different ways and at different scales, right? What role does the consumer piece play in this puzzle?
Well, again, I think when I look at energy transition, you've got obviously the supply side, where a lot of the narrative has really been focused over many years, right? How do we reduce the emissions footprint of the energy supply that is being provided globally? What is as or more important is the demand side. So how is that energy being used? How can we bring down the overall energy needs globally, and how can we be more efficient in how we go about that? And there's industrial users, all kinds of other users of energy, but you and I, our families, at the end of the day, are representing the largest component of that. And so I think all of us as individuals play a really important role in what are we prepared to do to facilitate this transition as well. There's some real challenges to that. I think one is awareness. None of us have a great sense of exactly what the emissions are that we're driving each and every day. When we eat a meal, we turn on our barbecue, we drive our kids to a soccer game, we get on an airplane to go to a conference, whatever it may be, we're all driving an emissions footprint. And I think the more we can build education and awareness that allows people then to make choices and conscious choices on the importance to climate to them and what they're prepared to do to change their behaviors to get there. I think affordability is a challenge. We are in a very inflationary environment right now, and that's putting pressure on a lot of individual households. The energy transition is going to cost a lot of money, and that will not all be borne by the private sector or by government. At the end of the day, some of those costs are going to get passed through to consumers, and there's going to be choices, again, that have to be made on how important is the transition versus the cost of doing
Totally.
that.
I think we're seeing that emergence of the term energy poverty, entering into the conversation a lot more than we had a couple of years ago, right?
And Peter brought up a great point. I think he might have described it a slightly different way, but convenience is a big factor, right? I mean, there are a lot of solutions today that, even if they're cost effective, are going to introduce a lot of inconvenience to people. And so, again, are we prepared to make some of those trade-offs in the spirit of where we need to get to globally as a society for 2050?
One of the things I want to ask you about, I saw walking in this morning, there's a great RBC logo that says your partner in energy transition, and we're very grateful to have RBC as partners for this event. But it struck me reading that going, there's a big responsibility that comes with coming out and owning a position like that, right? In terms of the role you've got to play as leaders in getting your own house in order. And I'd love to ask you the journey that you've been on as a company to actually think about what your role in leading, in role modeling, as an organisation yourselves looks like. Because you've got an enormous footprint, millions of customers across the world, 89,000 employees. What were some of the conversations that happened around your leadership table when you started to really turn your mind to this? Can you take us back to those?
Sure. I mean, I think first I would say it's not a new conversation. It literally has been going on for well over a decade.
Yep.
And I recall, attending a lot of internal sessions many years ago talking about ESG and the environment and climate and emissions. And so it has obviously accelerated dramatically, but it has been a dialogue that's been going on for quite some time. We take our role very seriously, and we feel we have a large and significant responsibility to be doing our part in terms of our own business, but importantly, how do we work with all of our clients? And as you said, we feel very privileged to be one of the largest financial institutions in the world. We deal with customers from individuals to corporates to governments to municipalities, which again is a very privileged position to be in. And so how do we lead? And how do we help guide on a path towards net zero? That really started with a lot of discussion on what is the path. And years ago, there was a lot of narrative around demarketing fossil fuels and exiting businesses. And we had a lot of discussion on what is actually a manageable, orderly, and fair path to get to the end game. And we do think it can be done. We're optimistic about that, but it is going to be a multi-decade transition.
Yep.
And as you referenced, all sources of energy, we're going to have to rely on all sources of capital. So we have to take a long-term view and make decisions along an orderly transition consistent with that. We've really then, on the back of that view, which has not always been an easy one.
I bet.
Either externally or internally, but we think it's the right approach as an orderly transition. we've then focused our efforts on 4 key areas.
Okay.
The first is how do we work with our clients? If you look at our activities, we actually don't directly have a large emissions footprint, but we obviously work with a lot of clients and facilitate their business, and that facilitates emissions their businesses may have. And so where we think we can have the biggest impact is working with our clients. And so that means giving them good advice in boardrooms. What can they do strategically? Where can they partner? How do they address, the objectives they're setting for their own businesses? How do we help finance that transition? There's different estimates out there, but globally, it's going to be $100 trillion or more. And we did complete a study last year. We think it'll cost Canada over $2 trillion to reach net zero. So obviously, as a financial institution, we have a big role to play on helping finance that transition. The second item, though, is we have to be accountable for our activities. And so we've been spending a lot of time in recent years getting very good data, which is not easy to do, but we've made great headway there on our financed emissions. And we're now going through the process of setting our own goals over multi-year periods to meet, our commitment to get to net zero on our financed emissions by 2050. Third area is managing our own footprint, which, as I said, we actually don't have a big emissions footprint, but we've got an objective to have 70% of our own energy needs from renewable or net zero by 2025. Sorry, a reduction of 70% by 2025 on our path to net zero. We've made very good headway investing in renewables, wind, solar to help offset our own footprint. And then the fourth key pillar for us is a little bit ties in today. What kind of role can we play on convening? Again, we think a major theme is bringing stakeholders together. And again, we have the privilege of dealing with a lot of clients, individuals, corporates, governments. How can we help facilitate the dialogue that has to go on around a very important topic?
I think there's a lot in that for all of us in terms of thinking about the role that we play with our customers through our supply chain, thinking about the data we're gathering, our own footprint, our targets and commitments we're making personally. There's a lot of relatability in that for all of us in whatever role we're playing in business and whatever organisation. I wanted to ask you something else, which I feel probably there's a number of us in the room that are maybe grappling with. You talked about the need to set long-term goals, which is critical. We're talking about things that are going to take a significant period of time to achieve, right? And Peter talked this morning about the dynamism, just how rapidly technology changes. I mean, even this year, and we're going to talk about it later today, the geopolitical reality and how that's shifted the way that we're viewing the risk associated with some of what we're talking about here. How do you manage that tension between long-term goals and the dynamism of the pace at which this world seems to be moving right now?
Great question, because I think that we would all agree if we look around us today, whether it's geopolitics, the economy, the energy sector, climate, the major theme right now is uncertainty and change. Everything is shifting at an accelerated pace, something we just haven't seen in decades. And I think we're going to continue to see these types of very big shifts occurring. So to your question, Holly, I think what that means is we have to set our goal and set a long-term strategy because it's just not going to be achievable in the near term. But I think we have to realize that we're going to have curveballs thrown at us, and we're going to have to pivot. And that means our strategy has to be balanced and diversified and have flexibility for the unknown contingencies that are going to arise. And I think that brings you back to the point that as we think about transitioning our energy supply, we really do need to rely on all sources. We need to look at conventional hydrocarbons, assume they're going to continue to be a meaningful part of the mix, but focus on how do we reduce the emissions and how do we continue to decarbonize conventional hydrocarbons. Renewables will play a big role, but there'll be challenges over time on wind and solar, and we can't be completely reliant on that. Nuclear brings its own challenges, but it probably in certain parts of the world will have a role to play. All the different technologies we're going to require, we need to be advancing them all at once. One, I just think they're going to be needed to address what is a very large challenge ahead of us. But two, it gives you the optionality and the flexibility that as unforeseen events come after us, you can pivot and you can change. Not completely deviate, but you've got some flexibility off of the longer term strategy and you can make those short term tactical shifts.
I feel like we're starting to add some things to our energy transition kind of backpack or rucksack, I think Peter referred to it as this morning. Peter talked about growth mindset. I feel like there you've touched on strategic flexibility. I wanted to ask for you personally, and again, probably thinking about all the leaders that are here in the room today, what is leading through this period requiring you to add to your toolkit? What have you had to call upon or develop in yourself that maybe wasn't as important to your leadership toolkit 5 years ago as it is today?
Great question. I mean, I would say a few things come to mind. To the point you just raised, adaptability and resiliency. I think we're seeing in all of our businesses, things are changing. And as a leader, you have to be more open-minded and more willing to adapt and change course than maybe you did 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. I think the second is recognizing leaders today have a much broader set of stakeholders that they need to be accountable to. It's shareholders, but it's employees, it's clients, it's the communities that you operate in. And being very balanced and understanding what each of those stakeholders is looking for, how you can communicate with them, how you can build support and motivation around your strategy or the direction you're trying to go, takes a much more balanced skill set, and I think a more understanding and empathetic skill set than maybe was needed many, many years ago.
And this point around communication and EQ or empathy in terms of the stakeholder piece is really telling. You're right, the complexities of that messaging piece and the reality of who you're dealing with now is so different to a decade ago.
Yeah, and I think, again, I'll tie it back to the theme of the conference. Against a backdrop of enormous change, I think being innovative and bold and not being afraid to make decisions and realizing they won't all work. None of us have all the answers, but you have to be brave enough to try, accept failure, change in a different direction. If you don't do that, we're not going to see the innovation that's going to be needed to address some of the challenges in front of us.
Speaking of innovation and risk, and we'll probably touch on this a little bit later today when we talk about specifically scaling and financing the energy transition. How are you thinking about that from the innovation that's going to be required from a financial instruments, financial products reality to support this? You know, there's a lot of commentary that we're going to need to think differently about the ways that we can structure investment, capital, you name it, in order to be able to support just, again, the movement of money, the reality of the risk profile involved in some of this, all of it. How are you thinking through that, or what are the conversations you're having as a team about that?
Lots of conversations around, capital and financing for the transition. I would say on the innovation theme, part of it comes back to this theme. This is a big ecosystem, and so we're not just dreaming it up on our own. We're in constant dialogue with our clients that are trying to raise capital, with investors that are looking to deploy capital, and determining how does that, what new structures align with the energy transition. And so, for example, we've seen enormous growth in the green bond market. We've seen enormous growth in sustainable linked loans and bonds, where the cost of financing varies depending on companies hitting certain targets. We're seeing new innovative structures around tax credits. And so as governments provide incentives, there's ways that tax credits can be used to fund some of the investments in renewables and solar and other things. We're now seeing, earlier stage discussion around not just sustainable linked financing instruments, but transition instruments, recognizing, again, high emitting sectors will play a critical role in decarbonization. So as opposed to just incentivizing sort of clean alternatives, how do you have the right financing mechanisms in place to incentivize higher emitting businesses on their journey through that transition?
Often referred to as the grey to green transition,
I believe. Exactly.
Yeah.
But lots going on, but I think it'll continue to evolve. And again, it comes back to this point of there's no simple answer, but if you convene and bring stakeholders together, you'll come up with some great solutions that meet everybody's objectives. I
want to circle back to something you talked about earlier, which was the $2 trillion Canadian reality. Can you just speak to your outlook from a Canadian perspective? Where's your level of optimism? What role do you think that Canada has to play? As you mentioned right at the start, this is a global game. This is a global reality emissions. Where's Canada's piece in this?
Look, I'm very optimistic about the opportunity that is in front of us as Canadians. This is a global challenge, but I think Canada has an outsized role that we can play. When you look at the stability of our economy, the stability of governments, our regulatory system, the private sector and the innovation and entrepreneurialism that I've highlighted, the technical know-how and capabilities, combined with a very strong financial system that I think can provide the capital. Plus, obviously, we're blessed with a large resource base in this country that will contribute to energy transition, whether that be hydro and wind or solar or conventional hydrocarbons. So I think we have all the building blocks in place for Canada as a country to play a very big role. And I think it's a big opportunity. It's not just an opportunity for the energy sector. I think it's an opportunity for all Canadians, because if done right, it will drive very significant economic growth. It'll be good for our society and our communities. It'll be good for individual Canadians. And I think we really, if done right, we can position ourselves as a leader in what is a critically important global challenge.
And if you're thinking about any call to action in a broadly Canadian context, so again, I'm not thinking about any particular Canadian sector here, I'm thinking about a room full of leaders across the Canadian industry. You spoke about having, whether we call them default advantages, strong building blocks. What is required from Canadian leaders to make sure that that is used to the fullest of advantage, that Canada seizes that opportunity?
Yeah, again, there's no simple answer to that. I think the biggest item that it comes back to for me is people working together. And if we can get sectors, government, financial institutions, individuals coming together, brainstorming, debating, contradicting one another, it won't be easy. You won't appease everyone, and you won't check the box on all the objectives at once. But if we can convene all stakeholders and come up with a thoughtful plan that works for Canada, with the right policy framework, with the right capital provision, with the right incentives for innovation for the industry, I think that we can be very, very successful.
I love that invitation, and you heard it from Peter on stage this morning, whether it's going and shooting hoops with someone who's got a different opinion to you, or sitting down at one of the coffee points and having a conversation with someone you may not have met yet. That importance that's come through everything you've said, Derek, around convening conversation. Very strong theme about how much this is based on the collision of ideas, the behavioural change of each and every one of us, whatever scale and stage and industry we're playing at, is of critical importance to anything moving forward. Derek, we've got very little time remaining. The final question I really wanted to ask you is, from your standpoint, when people are sitting down and having these conversations, what question would you invite them to engage in? What debate would you offer up between them? Is there any kind of closing thought around bringing people together? What's the conversation they should be having or leaning into together, do you think?
Look, I think it's the toughest question, but I think it's the one we all have to be asking. What is the path and what is the right pace? Because I think there's a lot of debate still on what is the right path to net zero in 2050. We've set great and important objectives and goals. I don't think we're clear yet as a sector, as a country, or globally on really what is the right path to get there and what is the appropriate pace to achieve what's a critically important objective around lowering emissions and addressing climate change while balancing the risks in terms of the economy and disruption and disorder along that journey. So to me, it comes back to how do we frame out an orderly transition around a thoughtful pathway to 2050? And that's not an easy answer, but I think that's the one we all have to just continuously debate. And
I love your point there, because one of the thoughts that struck me when you said that was that is not a one-off conversation. That is a constant conversation that we are iterating and evolving and learning every time we change who we're talking to about it, every time we get a new bit of information, the dynamism of what we're learning about. That strikes me as a series of conversations as opposed to a one-off. Can you join me, everyone, in thanking Derek Neldner so much for his contribution to our program? Derek, thank you.
Thanks, Holly.
Thank you so much.